by way of background, my earlier life was spent working as a consultant in infectious diseases at the Royal Free Hospital. And in addition to that, I'd spent 2 years out in Nigeria, in northern Nigeria, where there was a medical school and a UK MRC unit. And it was there in the late 1970s when I began to realize that some people who got an acute infection, and there was plenty of that in northern Nigeria, were not recovering completely. I discovered this with a number of other colleagues there by following them up in outpatients after we discharged them following treatment for their acute infection. And to digress a little bit into Hausa, which is the local language, one would say inagajia. And inagajia is, how is your tiredness? Because there was this curious tendency for people who'd just recovered from an acute infectious disease, by which I mean hepatitis, perhaps various forms of meningitis and so on, who didn't recover fully and just remained tired. And fortunately, most of those did eventually recover after about another 6 months. But when I came back to England, I discovered that we were seeing the same thing over here. And because of my particular interest in the condition, it was apparent to me that the cause of the tiredness was not a psychological cause. Although I was concerned to find that there were quite a few people in the medical profession who thought that it was basically this tiredness following an acute infection had a psychological basis. Now, I have always thought that was nonsense. And I'm going to take you through a few more slides just to show you why I think that's the case. So the historical issue essentially is whether there is a psychological cause underpinning this problem and whether alternatively it has a physical cause. I take you back first to the outbreak of what was later called myalgic encephalomyelitis by Dr. Melvin Ramsey, who was in charge of the infectious disease unit at the Royal Free Hospital in the 1950s. And he described this particular problem in these patients. And I've taken some of the wording out of his description. He said, he described severe fatigue, unrelieved by sleep, muscle pains, malaise with exercise beyond narrow limits, cognitive difficulties, spikes of fever, hypersensitivity to sensory stimuli. Spikes of fever, it's rather suggestive of immunological activity of some kind or other. Nonetheless, one of the downturns in the history of this condition occurred when two psychiatrists, McEvedy and Beard, published their hypothesis in relation to the condition, and they actually asked Melvin Ramsey for permission to look at all the case notes of these patients, and there were something like 284 patients altogether. And anyway, I'll read what they said. From a reanalysis of the case notes of patients with Royal Free disease, it is concluded that there is a little evidence of an organic disease affecting the central nervous system, and that epidemic hysteria is a much more likely explanation. The data which support this hypothesis are the high attack rate in females compared with males. I know that at least half of you here will object to that furiously. Essentially, I provided my own understanding of that particular hypothesis at the bottom there. And so essentially, here is the first account from people, psychiatrists, unsurprisingly, who decided to apply their own understanding of this illness, which diverted some of the really important scientific work to find out what the problem was. We have more psychiatrists, particularly Simon Wesley, who became the president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And he argued that ME is simply a belief, the belief that one has an illness called ME. And he presented that at a lecture in 1994 on the 12th of May, 9th Elliot Slater Memorial Lecture at the Institute of Psychiatry. And I've met Simon Wesley, and we've had some furious arguments, I can tell you. Sadly, because of his influence and the influence of a cabal of his colleagues, there is still this overriding tendency for many doctors, particularly general practitioners and psychiatrists and neurologists, to insist that this is a psychological disorder. And I get accounts like this from some of the patients I see. It's all in your mind, forget about your body. You have an abnormal illness belief. It's your buried guilt, dig it out. You should get pregnant. Go to the gym more often. And this is the sort of stuff that was prevalent and still is prevalent from time to time within the medical profession. And patients are being, sadly, one of the overall effects is severe demoralization. Because someone who's got a genuine physical illness, who's been told that it's all in their mind and the implication it's their fault, that's a big problem. Essentially, one of the things that I started doing when I was at the Royal Free was actually admitting patients with this condition and just observing them over a week or two. And one of the things which was evident about their condition was their immunological status. It was as if their immune system was turning over and was reacting in a way to otherwise harmless items which were just inappropriate. And fundamentally, this is one of the basic features of this condition, an overactive immune system, which some people have described quite fittingly as neurotic. It's as if they respond inappropriately to all sorts of harmless stimuli. I have patients who find that they can't share a room with someone wearing aftershave. There are other patients who stop being able to drink milk because they become lactose intolerant. And there are various other dietary items which cause terrible reactions, which are usually mediated by mast cells lining their gut. Now, if we move on to start indicating the science of the situation, you'll see that I've actually put in QED critical disease. This was one of the first studies of cerebrospinal fluid in patients with this condition. And the cerebrospinal fluid of these patients was full of so-called cytokines, which are basically a product of the immunological activity. And so these patients were detected and found to have this immunological activity, which was in the brain and central nervous system, which is evident from examination of their cerebrospinal fluid. And there's more of that to come too. The lady who wrote this paper, a lady called Maddie Horney, she concluded our results indicate a markedly disturbed immune signature in the cerebrospinal fluid of cases that is consistent with immune activation in the central nervous system. If we go on to the next slide, this is an extracted from a paper produced by some Japanese, Yasuhito Nakatomi, and they used a particular radiological technique known as positron emission tomography. Positron emission tomography, PET for short, requires you to take some blood off and you label that patient's white cells in the blood sample, usually with a radioactive isotope, and it's usually iodine. And then you take those white cells and put them back into the patient. And then you do this particular type of scan, which picks up areas of radioactivity because the white cells have been attracted there. And you find that these patients have neuroinflammation present in widespread brain areas in the CFS-ME patient and was associated with the severity of neuropsychological symptoms. So here we have a paper which indicates that most patients, particularly the ones most severely affected, have an obvious inflammatory process going on in their brains, which is almost certainly the basis of many of their symptoms. This is yet more indication for immunological activity in such patients. And Weir and Scheibenbogen, working in Berlin, have discovered a lot of autoantibodies, particularly autoantibodies against beta-2 adrenergic receptors, which are basically neurological receptors which play an important part in the subconscious running of the body. And if there's any problem with those, you get a problem called dysautonomia, which basically can be described as sort of as autonomic chaos, whereby patients just feel unwell, their blood pressure tends to fluctuate enormously, but often from a very low level. And so anyway, that's one particular group who've discovered all these different antibodies. And this lady, Bink, from Sweden, has also shown autoantibodies, not only in the blood, but also in the spinal fluid. So this further validates the proposition that this is an inflammatory condition of the central nervous system, albeit fairly low level. Right. Now, this brings me to talking about another of the pathological entities which is well recognized in this condition and which firmly establishes this condition as a physical disorder. And I've indicated here two medical references indicating a disorder of what's called the hypopituitary adrenal axis. In other words, the pituitary gland is not functioning as well as it should, and it's falling short of its requirement to actually produce the right hormones which instruct the kidneys to hold on to salt and water. And the vast majority of patients I see have got a problem referable to this, as evidenced by the fact that when they come in, some of them come in wheelchairs because they can't stand up, and they always have a flask of water with them, which they tend to sip throughout the consultation. And then sometimes the other refinement is that they have to get up and go to the toilet halfway through the consultation because their kidneys are just not holding on to enough salt and water to preserve their circulating blood volume. And sometimes I've had to sort of, with the occasional patient, I've had to sort of usher them to the toilet myself. And largely because of this problem with the circulating blood volume. The other clinical manifestation of that when they're severely affected patients is that they can't get out of bed, because if they try and get out of bed, immediately from their blood circulating in a horizontal fashion, when they're in bed, blood circulates back from the legs against gravity when they stand up. And if they've got a reduced blood volume in the first place, the less blood's going to get back to the heart. The heart's then going to pump out less blood to the brain, and they often feel faint and fall over. That's why many patients with this condition tend to be bedbound. And furthermore, why often they can be well served with intravenous normal saline, but that's a problem that sometimes one has great difficulty in persuading hospital doctors to administer. And therein lies this problem of the competing ideas of psychological physical disorder. I still see patients, sometimes in hospital I've been asked to see, in whom the consultant in charge thinks they're not getting out of bed because they are neurotic and they don't want to get out of bed to somehow or other. Well, I can't explain why they don't think they can get out of bed. But anyway, probably the most revealing study, which was done about 15 years ago, involved this thing called a bicycle ergometer. And the bicycle ergometer is essentially an exercise bike which measures the amount of power you're delivering through the pedals. And this chap is also wearing an oxygen mask, and the amount of oxygen he's breathing in is being carefully measured through a demand valve, and the demand valve opens when he breathes in, closes when he gets at the end of the breath. So the standard test here is to get the patient to cycle to the point of exhaustion. And what you get, firstly, is a graph like that indicating the energy being delivered through the pedals. And the amount of oxygen required to deliver that energy can be represented by this parallel line there. You notice that the oxygen that this patient is taking on board, it doesn't actually cease at that point. The amount it's being delivered ceases at that point. It's as if there's a point at which oxygen delivery remains the same, but doesn't actually go on increasing. And that point is known as the anaerobic threshold. And what you get when oxygen delivery reaches this peak level, that chap on the bike can actually go on delivering more energy, but by virtue of using a different metabolic pathway, which is known as the anaerobic pathway, which doesn't use oxygen. Now, it's basically a very short burst mechanism, which only lasts about maybe 5-10 seconds. And after that, this even healthy person will feel absolutely exhausted and will stop altogether. And I've represented what happens as the energy delivery plateauing off, oxygen delivery plateauing off as well, and that is known as the anaerobic threshold. Now, if you take a group of healthy people and you make them sit around for 6 weeks, deliberately deconditioning themselves, and you put them on the bike on day one, what you get is an anaerobic threshold down here. Now, if you get that same group of people and you put them on the bike again the next day, their anaerobic threshold, has raised just by a little bit, because they've rested overnight and they've felt a bit fitter. Now, if you take a similar group of moderately affected ME patients and you put them on the bike again on day one, they'll be here. Day two, they're down here. And this is an absolutely classic difference in the metabolic problems between someone who's just deconditioned and someone who's got ME, because exercise does not do this patient any good. Their anaerobic threshold goes down. And this is one of the important points to make with patients. You've got to tell them that in order to start the recovery process going, and I do see people recover sometimes after many years, but the clue to their recovery is that they've avoided breaching that anaerobic threshold. They've avoided crashes. And that's the way forward to start with, anyway. Those are basically the scientific references to what I've just described. Not only was one of the studies done in California, there was a follow-up study done at Columbia University about 2 or 3 years later. And 2 medical studies like that, using different patients, different equipment, but producing and the same protocols, producing the same results was a very good validation of the results from the first study. Now, to follow up on that, they in Newcastle, they looked at muscle biopsies from patients and took muscle biopsies from patients and from controls, i.e. people who are quite fit and well. And they subjected the muscles to electrical stimuli in the laboratory. And you can keep a piece of muscle after biopsy for quite some time. And the muscles from the ME patients performed at a much lower level than the muscle biopsies from patients the controls who were normally fit. Point to make here is that a piece of muscle taken from someone with ME is no longer subject to any influence from their psyche. And so clearly, when you actually do the test in the lab, in vitro, that test is absolutely valid. And so again, there's an indication of physical disease. I mentioned earlier that pituitary dysfunction causes a reduction in circulating blood volume because the two hormones from the pituitary, which control blood volume, are not operating, are not being produced in sufficient quantity. So you end up with someone who's constantly thirsty and drinking, peeing out a lot, and their blood volume is lower than it should be. And this is an extract from a patient, from a lecture given by Nancy Climax, who is really one of the ACE authorities on this condition in the United States. And she says, you guys are about 1 litre short in blood volume, okay? If I'm sitting at 5 litres, you're sitting at 4. So you're really, really sensitive to blood volume changes. If you're a little dry, you crash. And ne'er a truer word was spoken. So the treatment involves additional salt intake, but with fluid as well. And IV saline with midodrine for POTS. Now, midodrine acts on blood vessels, which the blood vessels control the baroreceptor reflex, and which are controlled by the baroreceptor reflex. And that can often help with some people insofar as it prevents this pooling of blood in patients who are prone to getting postural symptoms because of the gravity affecting the return of blood from the legs. This is basically a couple of diagrams, firstly of a capillary bed, showing you the arteries supplying the capillary bed and the veins draining it. And you can see that the capillaries are absolutely tiny. They're only small enough. They're small enough. They're not large enough to admit more than a red cell in diameter through them. And essentially, if you've got a low volume circulating, that process is going to be reduced. And in addition to that, not only is your blood of low volume, that blood, because it's lacking an essential component of salt and water, is going to be more viscous. And so the viscosity of that blood will affect this process of delivery of oxygen and other nutrients through the capillaries. And so it's very important indeed with most patients to try and maintain their blood volume by prescribing glucose electrolyte mixture as much as possible. But in the end, with such patients, it's very important indeed to look for the fundamental cause of their low blood volume, which is pituitary impairment. And some patients I've seen, they would turn up to see me, pull a flask of water out, put it on the desk in front, sip it throughout the consultation, and in about 6 months' time, usually, and manage to get their pituitary function checked. And if they're taking the right hormones, that problem is completely overridden and is dealt with. So, curiously, one of the interesting problems I come across with some patients is that they often have postural symptoms referable to a reduction in blood flow throughout their body. And they've been diagnosed as such by cardiologists. But the cardiologists don't go any further. They don't go any further and say, right, well, why is your blood volume low? Instead, what they tend to do is actually prescribe slow sodium salt tablets, which is, partially effective. But what those patients needed, and first and foremost, is examination of their pituitary function with correction of the hormones which are lacking. One or two other points to make. Mast cell activation is really a big problem in some patients. And the most serious problem is with digestion and nutrition. The patients I have been involved with in the past who sadly go on to die have usually had serious problems with their mast cells, and they have often needed total parenteral nutrition. And there was one quite well-known patient down in Exeter that I was involved with about 5 years ago. And I actually, realized that her mast cells were not functioning properly. She couldn't take anything on board which was appropriately nutritious. And it was apparent to me that that was very much the case. So I actually wrote to the hospital CEO and said, look, she needs total parenteral nutrition. And I got a message back to the effect that total parenteral nutrition was too dangerous for her. But the irony was that she died about 4 weeks later, which was quite extraordinary. Now, another point to make, and I've been realizing relatively recently that neuropathic pain with this condition is a very constant feature, particularly in the more seriously affected. And I've got one patient again down in Exeter that I've seen from time to time. And she gets a curious sort of pain, which she describes as a burning pain. And she's hyperesthetic to the touch. You can just touch her with the point of a finger, and that's painful for her. And curiously, this is a feature that one sees in patients with hereditary angioedema. Hereditary angioedema is a condition characterized by bursts of bradykinin production. And these patients get this curious all-over pain, sometimes only involving the abdomen, and they get serious levels of abdominal pain due to edema of the lining of the gut, again because the bradykinin interacts with the mast cells. And it's always occurred to me that one of the things we should be trying for such patients, in such ME patients who get the same problem, is a bradykinin antagonist. And I'm sort of actively trying to recruit patients at the moment who get this particular type of pain. And the other feature of hereditary angioedema, quite apart from the pain, which is so similar, they get intermittent swellings subcutaneously from time to time. And my patient in Exeter gets the same thing. And she's got photographs to show me, which I was trying to bring tonight, but I didn't manage the technology of it. But anyway, the other approaches for the pain involve CBD derivatives. Various cannabinoids can help. Gabapentin occasionally helps. Lignocaine infusion for some patients works very well. B12 injections. The curious thing about vitamin B12 is that in this context, it has a completely different pharmacological activity to its normal biological function. Pharmacologically, B12 seems to be effective by injection in neutralizing the inflammatory byproducts that I was talking about earlier, and is certainly very helpful for some people, but not everyone. And then opiates. Clearly, one needs to try and avoid long-term opiates in some patients, but very occasionally one has to defer to the patient's interest in actually maintaining them pain-free. at the expense of them becoming dependent on opiates. Curiously, it doesn't seem to happen very often. It's as if the need for the opiate, pain relief, is such that it's in inverse proportion to the danger of getting dependency. So, anyway, the end. I think if someone asked me, will a cure arrive soon? And I'm going to say, well, I think it might well do, but it's going to take a while and a lot of further scientific research. And I think that ultimately the cure is going to be an immunological cure of some kind. But it requires some fairly effective work to actually identify the precise way of shutting down all that excess immunological activity. Thank you.